impulse, or the first drive, was the drive for security, both individual and collective security. Jewish communities, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, felt insecure, especially during the 19th century, but also in previous centuries, and they were victims of persecution, oppression, and discrimination. And this came to a certain culmination in the mid-19th century, and especially in the later part of the 19th century. And Zionism was one of the many Jewish responses, it was not the only Jewish response, for a growing sense of insecurity. The second impulse was the need, or the wish rather, to become a national group or a national movement. It was an attempt to redefine, in many ways, to reinvent Judaism, which is a religion more than anything else, and a civilization, to reinvent it as nationalism. This was born under the influence of the emergence of other national movements around the Jewish communities, especially in the mid-19th century. There was a period which we call in history the Spring of Nations, which many groups in Europe, ethnic groups, religious groups, cultural groups, were fascinated with this new modern invention of nationalism. And it was only natural that some Jewish intellectuals, especially Jews who wanted to assimilate more into their society, thought that nationalism for the Jews was as legitimate as the idea of Polish nationalism, Romanian nationalism, and all the other nationalist identities that emerged in the mid-19th century. As I say, these two impulses, I said in the beginning of my talk, these two impulses, these two drives, were quite human, normal, and in many ways noble. They did not hurt anybody and did not undermine anybody else's rights or existence. The problem with the idea of creating a Jewish national movement that would secure the life of European Jews, the problem began when the leaders of the movement decided to territorialize it, to find a territory in which to implement these two impulses, these two drives, for security and for nationhood. And the moment they have chosen Palestine, and as some of you may know, they had other options, and they actually considered very seriously other options, such as Uganda, Argentina, provinces in Russia, even some counties in America. But the moment they have chosen Palestine, the national security project, if you want, became a colonialist project. Because contrary to the mythology that is still spread in some places in this country, Palestine was not an empty land waiting for a people without a land. Palestine was a land in which another people lived, thrived, had a very lively culture, and like so many other peoples in the Middle East, was in the process of becoming a national movement, a national people by themselves. And like the rest of the Arab world, was moving towards independence, autonomy, and self-determination. And the moment that the idea that you want to secure one life at the expense of the people who live in another place, the noble impulses, the noble drives for independence and security are replaced by a project of dispossession, colonization, and later on occupation. And this, although it happened many, many years ago, this is in a nutshell the problem for anyone who wants to understand the Zionist project in its entirety, in its full frame. Because if you take away but you can't. But for the sake of argument, if you take away from a moment the fact that in order to implement Zionism, you had the logic, the inner logic of the project was that you had to drive out the Palestinians. If for one moment you can forget it, then of course Zionism becomes a very successful project and a movement that had many impressive achievements. It gathered Jews from all around the world and turned them into one ethnic group on the land of Israel. Later on, when Jews were under existential threat in Europe, it saved quite a large number of Jews. It revived the Hebrew language. It became a very technological society, a very modern society. And you can paint a very positive picture. And much of the parts of that picture are genuine. But the moment you complete the picture by looking at Zionism and its impact on Palestine, on the Palestinians, so much of the positive achievements become darkened and clouded with the fact that Zionism was bad news to the Palestinians from beginning to end. So the first historical fact, in a way, that we should confront and keep in mind, especially if we want to understand the reality today, is the way Zionism developed from a national, if you want, even human project into a colonialist or settler colonialist project. And colonialism at the time that Zionism emerged was still a positive term. So many people in Europe were involved in colonialism. But long after colonialism ended, Zionism remained a colonialist project, as it is still today. And this is why it's so important to learn and study the origin of Zionism in Palestine as a colonialist project. Because the colonialist project has not ended until today. And actually what Israel asks the world to support and accept is the maintenance of the only colonialist state still existing in the midst of the Arab world. And what it demands from the Palestinians is to accept to be the last colonized people upon the earth. The second station in this history is 1917. The colonialist project in Palestine would have not survived by itself. The number of Jews who opted to be colonialist settlers in Palestine was very limited. The numbers of colonies they had established was not very big. Their financial, military, and political capabilities was quite limited. They needed, in the words of today's jargon, they needed a superpower to support them. Without it, it would have been impossible. And had it not been for the decision of the British government in November 1917 to fully support the idea of the Jewish colonization of Palestine, the project would have already failed at the end of the First World War. This is very important to remember, that in a way the British bayonets were protecting the colonialist project of Zionism at its very early stages, when it was still vulnerable and things could have developed in a different way. Of course, this all came to be articulated in a very clear way in the Balfour Declaration of the 2nd of November 1917, when Britain offered something which did not belong to it, to someone it didn't belong to. And there is nothing more illuminating for understanding what goes on today from reading again and again the text of the Balfour Declaration. I think, again, it's in a nutshell an explanation and representation of the Palestine issue as we know it today. It's a document which states that Britain would help the Jewish people to build a national homeland in Palestine, and promises that this national homeland would not be built against the basic interests and aspiration of the native population of Palestine.